Hello, and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be hosting this One Business World webinar on methane, the environmental damage, the portfolio risks, and the agricultural gap. My name is Hamish Monk. I'm a reporter in sustainability, in finance and technology, and I am a council member of the Chartered Institute of Journalists. Let me start by introducing our esteemed guests today. We have Nusa Urbancic, the CEO of Changing Markets Foundation. Welcome, Nusa. And we have François Mosnier, head of nature at Planet Tracker. So welcome both of you. Thank you very much for joining. Um, well, we are going to examine a huge issue today, methane, often dubbed the climate emergency brake. We're going to look at the impact of methane on the environment. We're going to explore the sectors and companies responsible for its emission. And we may even touch on the industrial lobbying efforts that are working to prevent its regulation. We're also going to explore the risks of methane to investors and their portfolios, and maybe even how Europe can lead the charge in moving from methane commitment to successful implementation. So plenty of ground to cover. I'm really excited. Nus, I'll kick off with you if I may. Let's start by building a picture of this super polluting compound. What is methane exactly? Why is it referred to as the climate emergency brake? And why is it important that we tackle this separately to all the other super pollutants?
Yes, thanks for having me and thanks for this question. So, methane is, we like to refer to it as a greenhouse gas on steroids. It's extremely potent. It's 80 times more powerful than CO2 over 20 years, but it's also short-lived. That means it starts breaking down in the atmosphere after around 12 years, which means that it has this very specific quality. So, if you quickly reduce methane emissions, you can actually have significant short-term impact on warming. So you're slowing down warming. And also, methane is right now responsible for around half degree of warming. So that's around a third of the temperature increase we have since pre-industrial levels. And unfortunately, it's not really being taken that seriously yet because 2 to 3% of funding on climate mitigation funding is actually going into methane mitigation. So it's a huge opportunity, but it's underinvested, I would say.
And thank you, Nusa. And Francois, let me bring you in. What would you say, from your perspective, are the biggest kind of sources of methane emission? I know that agriculture specifically is often seen as a kind of overlooked sector.
Yeah, thank you for this question and also for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. Um, I think obviously oil and gas and the energy sector in general is the key sector, and this is where there's been the most effort on methane mitigation so far. But agriculture alone is about 40, I think 42% of methane emissions today. So it's a huge contributor. The way it works is quite simple. Actually, it's from livestock digestion primarily, for manure as well, but also, and I think that's probably less known, for rice paddies. Um, I think you said overlooked as a sector, agriculture. I think overlooked because to be honest, it's perhaps even more challenging to mitigate methane emissions from agriculture than it is in the oil and gas sector. Uh, Policy investor focus so far has been on fossil fuel. And the problem of the agricultural sector, of course, is that it's diffuse, smallholder, supply chain emissions, harder to measure and regulate.
Lisa, Francois mentioned there the policy side of things. Perhaps we touch on the regulation we kind of already have out there. Of course, we've got the global methane pledge. Over 150 countries signed and committed to cutting methane by 30% for 2030. We're already in the second quarter of 2026, so time is running short. Perhaps you can provide us with an update on how progress is going there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Global Methane Pledge was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And last year, the UNEP and Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which acts a little bit as like informal secretariat of the pledge, released a report where they looked at where we are. And they kind of concluded that if you, all the measures that the countries promised, either in methane action plans or in their national determined contributions, which is how they report that how they will meet the Paris Agreement. If all of this was to come true, the emissions would fall by 8% by 2030. So this means we are bending a curve a little bit. For the first time, this would actually mean decrease in methane emissions, but we're not actually there. Like we're not meeting 30% reductions. What they did say, if we put all the technical measures that are feasible, we would get to 32% reductions. However, agriculture is a little bit behind when it comes to that. Emissions from agriculture would still rise up 4% by 2030, even with this implementation of NDCs and methane action plans. So this is really why we like to say that agriculture is a little bit of an orphan when it comes to mitigation of methane emissions.
Sure. And just to follow up on that, I understand CMF has done some research in this space. Perhaps you could give us an idea of, some of the biggest offenders, which kind of agricultural companies are emitting the biggest volumes of methane.
Yes, when we looked at the biggest methane polluters, we looked at the biggest meat and dairy companies, and that's actually quite difficult to get estimates of their production because most companies are not very transparent in the amount of dairy they process and amount of animals that they slaughter. But the biggest offender is Brazilian beef producer JBS. And this company's methane emissions are massive. They're basically a combination of four different livestock producing countries if you put it together. The second one that came up was Marfrig, which was actually had similar methane emissions to the whole livestock sector of Australia. And then Tyson is also a big one. Nestle, of course, Danone, Saputo. So all these big dairy and meat producing companies, and their emissions are equivalent to those of countries and even those of fossil fuel companies like JBS total CO2, so not just methane, but the total CO2 emissions would be something similar to ConocoPhillips, so like quite a big fossil fuel company. And we estimated at the time that combining those methane emissions would actually be similar to the methane emissions of Russia. So that is, all methane emissions, so fossil fuel and everything that Russia emits. So yeah, it's quite a concentrated industry. So this is why we try to make this, narrative shift that this is not down to individual farmers and producers. It's actually most of the methane is in the supply chains of these huge international corporations, and those companies have the resources to tackle methane emissions.
Thank you, Nusa. And Francois, I'll come back to you shortly. But just before I do, you've kind of provided a blacklist, as it were, for the biggest offenders. Do you have an understanding of the companies that are doing well with disclosure of their emissions, the kinds of companies that are achieving, important reductions? Perhaps you could walk through some of those findings.
Yes, absolutely. So, Changing Markets has this methane action tracker. It's a website where we monitor progress. And at the moment, we have dairy and coffee brands, and we also have retailers. The retailer ranking will be updated next week. So, watch the space. Yeah, basically, we are looking at progress, and we've seen some progress. So we have two dairy companies, Danone and Bell Group, that have set methane reduction targets. We have several additional companies that are reporting methane emissions in methane These are Group Bell, Danone, Kraft Heinz, General Mills, Clover Sonoma, and Starbucks. So that means reporting in a disaggregated form, which is what, is the best standard. And then we have other companies that have joined this EDF-run initiative, the Dairy Methane Action Alliance, that now has 10 companies, and they have to disclose methane emissions, and they also have to publish an action plan on how they're going to reduce. And early reductions have been recorded by Bell Group, Kraft Heinz, and Nestle. And Danone, actually, this was a company that was a front runner, the first company that came up with a commitment. And their commitment was 30% reductions by 2030. And this year they published their annual sustainability report, and they already almost achieved this commitment 5 years early. So that is something important. The lesson here is if companies are actually serious about methane mitigation and they set targets, they can actually achieve this. So it's not that difficult to abate. Then, it's often heard in the action in this sector. And yeah, this is kind of why when we launched this report with Planet Tracker, we also said that it's important for investors to come into this now and actually support companies that are doing these good practices and ensure that this is kind of more, that the sector ramps up action, because it's really such an important thing, cutting methane emissions at this point in time.
It's good to hear there are successful proof of concepts that we can glean from, especially from the big names.
Yeah, we even have,
Francois,
sorry, I forgot to mention, we even have the first meat company, Marfrig, that set a methane target. They're 33% by 2035.
let's hope they adhere to that. That's good to know. Francois, from your perspective, how important is accurate methane disclosure, and how vital is it, would you say, that we track those scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, I will surprise you and tell that it's very important. But no, I think fully agree with what Nusha just said. On the importance of disclosure, I would just mention one thing. Before the last 5 years, I focused on seafood and ocean, which is why I still have this background. And so the world of agriculture was kind of new to me. But what surprised me is all NGOs would focus on JBS, JBS, JBS. And I thought, but why? Um, Now, Nusha mentioned that they're the biggest, and they are, but the extent to which they are the biggest needs to be seen in a chart. So if JBS emissions shrank by 10%, that would it's as if Danone or Nestle didn't exist in terms of methane emission. It's really big. So I think that's key. But the issue with not specifically JBS, but the sector in general is that you don't really have est accurate disclosures on methane emissions. So we had to estimate them. We did that for 52 largest companies. And the difficulty, of course, is that within the emissions of a given company, the vast majority occurs is scope 3, right? It's in the supply chain. So this is where I think there's a lot that still needs to be done. Because if you're, say, an investor and you care about that, or lending, bank lending to these companies, you are basically flying blind. So I think that's something that is very important to note. What do I mean, maybe specifically for the audience by scope 3? What does that mean in reality? It's effectively enteric fermentation, linked manual management, rice cultivation, etc., etc. So if you're a company, this is where the emissions occur, if you want. And so if you don't have scope 3 data on this, you can't really quantify the progress that a given company is making. But it's good to have some of the new announcements that Nusha mentioned, especially Marfrig. I thought hopefully that looks very promising.
And if I can put it plainly, why should corporates and FIs really care about this? I mean, is there anything we can say about the financial materiality of tackling methane emissions?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and that's the whole raison d'être, if you forgive my French, of Planet Tracker, is that even if you didn't really care about the environment, let's be crazy. There is a need to act for companies and for investors. So I think Nusha perfectly mentioned how methane is a powerful near-term climate driver, um, and also how it's basically the best one of the best emergency brake we have. So unmanaged methane directly amplifies transition, physical, and policy risks for companies that are exposed. That's just at a high level. That's obvious. But for a given company itself, uh, the emission of a lot of agricultural methane means that translates into physical risk and also transition risk from future regulation, a transition risk from carbon pricing, but also market and reputational risk. As more and more buyers and lenders, and we engage with them on a weekly basis, uh, these lenders or these investors are screening out high emission suppliers, or at least demanding them to change. But perhaps I should give you one example of why does it matter in a way. Just looking at the US beef industry, right now it's facing one of the worst crises it had in terms of drought. It's severe, it's prolonged, and right now there's the lowest cattle inventory in the US in over 70 years because of what? Lack of water, grazing forage, particularly in the Great Plains area. It forced rangers to liquidate herds early. That hurts both producers, major meat processor, etc. I'm not saying this is 100% for sure linked to climate change because the science always have estimates around that. We know degree of error, but it's very likely that climate change is contributing to that. So you have a business that is emitting a lot of methane, which in turn makes the climate crisis worse, and that hits them back. So there are lots of companies like Tyson that have faced significant losses as a result due to tight cattle supplies, and that's linked to reduced processing capacity. And they also have to make some plants idle. So it is definitely material for corporates. And for finance, I think you asked also for financial institutions. Well, that means that your net zero commitment, your at the portfolio level, can be severely affected by just a few companies, typically in the meat and dairy or rice sectors.
Thank you, Francois. And one follow-up question, if I may, before I return to you, Nusa. This is, but how should the financial sector kind of best engage with these big agromethane emitters?
Yeah, so it's a question that we're dealing with right now at the moment. We are engaging with the financial sector. I had a conversation with a very large bank just yesterday to talk about that. So what we're asking them is quite simple and it's doable because some are already doing it. So it's to integrate methane explicitly into risk and portfolio management. Why? Because of the financial materiality element that I've just mentioned. So that means you're a portfolio manager or you're an analyst. I was one before, so I know how it works. You need to map your exposure to agricultural methane. You need to treat it as a distinct risk factor in credit risk analysis or equity risk analysis, valuation models, etc. That's key. And I think anecdotally, in finance, when you look at a company, there will always be like a handful of really key driver for that company. We want to make sure that the financial sector will treat methane as one of them. The second one is to strengthen stewardship. So we need separate methane disclosure, short-term and long-term methane reduction targets, and also detailed abatement and capex plans. So that's a key way to basically reduce greenwashing risk. And I think we also need to understand, the financial sector also needs to vote appropriately. And if needed, we encourage companies to change their capital allocation based on what companies are doing. I think that is quite key. And I was saying it's doable because some are already doing it. We've engaged with one of the largest asset managers in the world, effectively the Norges Bank Investment Management. In our analysis, we found they're the only investor to explicitly reference to the global Methane Pledge, to embed methane expectation into their climate action plan, but also to encourage companies in methane-intensive sectors. We think if they can do it, a long list of asset managers can do it. And when it comes to banks, I think it's the same. The last thing I would say is that banks have a really key role, and we've released a report on Thursday to talk about that because they have actually financing. They're providing new capital to the industry, so they have a key opportunity to make sure that they care about methane. And in particular, what we found, and I'll finish on that, is that banks lend money, but they also facilitate the issuance of bonds. And that is a huge part of their business. In our analysis, 96% of the capital that was provided by the 25 largest banks to the sector was in the form of bonds. Very often, any emissions target for banks are not covering bonds, only loans. And yet this is the bulk of the financing. So I think if there's also one key message for banks is to make sure that emissions cover bonds.
Thank you, Francois. And Nusa, if we can for a moment, let's zoom out from the financial services sector and think about the big macro picture, government action, countries. You already mentioned Brazil. I know CMF's methane action tracker looks at these big livestock producing countries. Perhaps you could share some of your findings regarding what those jurisdictions are doing on methane.
Yeah. So just to say that for a lot of countries, the bulk of methane comes actually from agriculture. So from European Union, it's 54% is livestock, Brazil 74%. New Zealand, again, it's an interesting example because the majority of their emissions even are agriculture, and that's methane. And it was the only country that had a specific methane target. But unfortunately, they recently weakened this target because they went for this no additional warming approach. So that's kind of like, the opportunity of cutting methane through the mirror world, like it's turned around on its head, where they're saying, oh, because it's short-lived, we actually only have to stabilize the emissions. We don't have to reduce them, which has been very criticized by climate scientists. But yeah, what we did find is that the majority of countries, big livestock producing countries, are actually not doing that much. And the reason is the so-called agriculture exceptionalism, which means that the lobby is so powerful and it's so close to the government that it always manages to get exceptions and exemptions and actually weaker measures. It's very often just limited to voluntary measures or incentives, and sometimes this includes technical solutions and amplified solutions such as biogas and feed additives that are then subsidized with public money. What we really miss is those countries acting on the scientific consensus that dietary shift is needed to meet global wider climate targets, so not just methane. When we analyzed 28 NDCs, and the European Union one, and we found that only 5 included reference to shifting diets to less meat and dairy. So these were Switzerland, Germany, Ireland, Mexico, and Norway. the rest of the countries kind of continue to have this as a major blind spot. Also, only 4% of NDCs include targets. And yeah, we also looked at the analysis from Oxford Climate Policy Monitor, which kind of shows that from 37 jurisdictions, only 11 have mandatory policies on agriculture and methane. So that remains a huge missed opportunity, and yeah, something that we're advocating to change.
And it's worth bringing in here the Montreal Protocol, an existing structure that we might be able to take some lessons from. It's often seen as a successful instrument. Could you ever imagine something similar to that being put into place for methane?
There have been some ideas to turn global pledge into a protocol and start with the fossil fuel sector. I think, yeah, from our perspective, it would be a missed opportunity not to include agriculture as well. Um, and again, the big question is always the finance. So making sure that there is finance in place to kind of get this mitigation off the ground. And yeah, it's possible that we should start with like a few countries that are actually willing to go there. But Montreal Protocol has always been mentioned as a very successful kind of model that could be replicated in other super pollutants.
Absolutely. And Francois, just would be good to get your take on any kind of regulations or standards that would help investors, drive methane action in agriculture. Any further steps we could take there?
Um, I think Nusha's mentioned a lot already, but I think one thing would be to have an agreement and standardized the financial regulation, what governs what investors or banks can do. The reason why I mentioned that is that there's now, let's say, several standards that would cover different types of GHG emissions. Whether or not methane is included really depends. And within that, whether Scope 3 emissions are covered or not is, well, it really depends. But what we found is that there's only one really, which is called PCAF. So sorry for the technicality, but it's covering GHG emissions that looks very appropriate to properly mitigate methane emissions, and that's a standard that is voluntary for now. So if something bigger like the ISSB, for instance, would also fully capture what we've discussed before, that would be, I think that would be key.
Thank you. And before I move on to our kind of closing statements, just to kind of look to the future, some upcoming EU reviews. We have the NEC directive and effort sharing regulation. A question for either of you, so feel free to jump in. How will that feed into progress here? Any likely challenges we can expect along the way?
Yeah, so European Union had a Green Deal in the last mandate, and part of that was farm to fork strategy, which then unfortunately got like a lot of the policies got weakened or completely dropped, and even the farm to fork strategy got dropped officially a few weeks ago. But that doesn't mean that methane can't be included in other pieces of regulations. And a very promising one is the NEC, the National Emissions Ceilings Directive, which is actually about air pollution. And we mentioned before, but probably not enough, that methane is also an air pollutant. It's a precursor of ground level ozone. And in many countries, these emissions are not going down. They're causing premature deaths. In Europe, around 70,000 premature deaths, and then also huge negative financial impact on crops because it's intervening with the crop growth. And currently, around 12 more than 12% of European agricultural land is exposed to too high levels of ozone. And methane is one of the few gases that is not yet regulated as an air pollutant. And the reason is, again, the lobbying from the dairy industry and the farm lobby, the powerful farm lobby, Copa Cogeca, really did not want to see that. But it's again, like Francois was mentioning, this is impacting profitability of the sector. It is impacting, yeah, kind of just yeah, the food production as such, and food production is very, very sensitive to climate crisis, to things like droughts, floods, etc. So and it's also impacting the health of Europeans, which is a really, really important aspect. So even, when politics shifts to the right, health issues, the environmental issues might jump off the agenda a little bit, but health issues do not in the same way. So we are hoping that in the next revision of the NEC directive, methane will be included as an air pollutant, and that countries will be obliged to reduce methane emissions on that basis. And effort sharing regulation is kind of dealing with the sectors that are not energy, so transport, agriculture, and waste. And agriculture and waste are still huge sources of methane. And as European climate targets get tighter, there is more need to do something about agriculture methane emissions also. So we're involved in those processes. This will be discussed at the European Union in the coming years. And it is likely that, more action will have to happen in order to kind of align with the climate targets.
Thank you,
If
Nusa. And I'm just sorry, Francois, feel free to jump
sorry,
in.
yeah, I mean, I just wanted to point one more thing on top of what Anusha said, and I fully agree with it. I think at the end of the day, a good regulation should do three things, right? On methane, it should make it visible. Currently, it's not really the case. It should make it comparable between companies, and also, I think that's crucial, make it costly to ignore. Um, and currently, the EU CSRD requires Scope 3 disclosure where material. And I think the where material, it's obvious that this we're talking here about an issue that is material for the relevant companies, but it's very difficult actually, or I can't think of any case where a company was accused of not having correctly implemented this materiality point from a legal perspective. So I think that the regulation could be probably or should be more prescriptive. And the second and last point, and we haven't talked about that, but a regulation, yes, but there's also the question of subsidies. And so subsidies in these sectors are, let's say, not necessarily going in the right direction, to say the least. And I think one right direction, I completely understand that it's politically sensitive to reduce subsidies, but at the very least, reallocate them to support the many solutions that exist. We have not talked about them, but there's tons of solutions to the methane crisis in the livestock or rice sector. Some of them have the issue of being relatively costly for now because they are small scale and they need more support. I think a reallocation of subsidy could be something to definitely to explore on top of private capital, obviously, which is something that we're also advocating for.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up subsidies. That's a really important point. And I also want to add that the European Scientific Advisory Committee actually talked about agriculture as a priority issue, and that also we need to price agricultural emissions and also support reduction of meat and dairy overconsumption that is causing a lot of other issues also, not just climate and environmental issues, but also health issues for Europeans.
Absolutely. I mean, it's clear this is such a broad topic, and I'm sorry we have to start closing because it's been very interesting, and I'm sure we could talk for a long, long time. I hope we've managed to be kind of concise and broad without being cursory for the audience's sake. I think we have achieved that. And to close, perhaps you could both reflect on the following for me. Of course, food production is dependent on stable climatic conditions, and yet most of the big food companies and their investors aren't taking this seriously, and that's despite the fact that their profits depend on how successfully we tackle this crisis. So, if I can come to you first, Francois, if you could take one measure to cut methane, one big headline piece of action, whether it be legislation, a financial structure, a technological innovation, which would you pick?
I see. Very easy question to finish on. I think I'll be biased here, but I've seen firsthand the incredible power that the financial sector has on these large companies. And I think I would make sure that whenever an analyst or portfolio manager meets the CEO or CFO of these companies, they typically have 5 to 10 points to discuss every quarter whenever they meet. I would make sure that asking for a reduction in the implementation of a strong, valid, scientifically robust methane reduction plan would be at the top of the list. Because I think at the end of the day, if there was consensus within the financial community to demand that, I think it will happen.
And Nusa, I hand over to you for your final thoughts on that.
Yes, I would end with two things. Maybe one is regulating companies to kind of set science-based reduction targets and report on them. Because I think what Francois was saying, actually, that would really focus their minds. Like we've seen with Danone, they were able to almost meet their target 5 years early. And then the second thing is policy, of course, because policy should enable that kind of action. And I think what we're really missing in policy is implementation of healthy diets. So the things that are already recommended by medical professionals. So we should be reducing meat and dairy consumption, shifting more towards plant-based proteins. And we did a calculation a few years back that this would be the most effective measure in the European Union. If half of population shifted to healthier diets, what is already recommended, we would meet 45% methane reduction easily. So that is more than the pledge. This is what the science recommends. And this would bring a lot of other benefits for the population and yeah, potentially enable us to, also reduce pesticides, fertilizers, and all these inputs that the agriculture depends on so much at this point in time, which again, with the Strait of Hormuz, a lot of fertilizer is stuck there. And this is, another crisis is looming because of that. So yeah, I would end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, maybe that's an interesting message we can take away from this chat. Change your diet is good for your health and for the planet. Thank you. Well, on that note, we'll close. Thanks again to you both. It's been very interesting. It feels that methane, is a huge existential issue, but we have the structures, we have the knowledge needed to tackle it. And those who really commit will reap the rewards. So here's to more huge strides at COP31 in November. Thank you, Nusa. Thank you, Francois. And thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye now.
Hamish.
Bye.